For centuries, galaxies burned, fleets clashed in the void, civilizations crumbled, and the war dragged on. Merciless, endless. Entire species threw everything they had into the conflict, but no side could gain the upper hand, and then humans arrived. Not with massive armadas, not with superior numbers, but with something far more terrifying: resolve. What happened next didn't take months. It didn't take days, it took hours, and when it was over, the universe finally understood what it meant to awaken a sleeping giant. Today, I want to tell you the story of the moment everything changed, the moment humanity entered the fight. Let me know if you want a more dramatic, humorous, or cinematic tone. For centuries, stars burned not with hope, but with war. Endless, grinding, merciless war. Across galaxies, across time, across civilizations, millions of species rose to power, only to be pulled into a conflict that seemed as eternal as space itself. Massive fleets clashed in orbit above dying planets. World after world turned into scorched husks. Peace was a myth, diplomacy a forgotten language. The war had no clear beginning and certainly no end. It simply was. Empires collapsed, alliances fractured, the older races, the ones who remembered peace, had grown bitter, exhausted, resigned to existence where survival was the only goal. The younger species knew nothing else. They were born into it, bred for it. To them, war was not a tragedy, it was tradition. A cycle that couldn't be broken, only endured, and in all this chaos, no side could gain the upper hand. Superweapons were countered by shields. Cloaked ships were undone by psychic sensors. Engineered soldiers met them. Machin machines made of living metal. Every advancement was mirrored, every advantage temporary. The balance held firm, held tight, until something unexpected happened. A signal was intercepted. A new race had made first contact. They called themselves humans. At first, the galaxy didn't pay much attention. After all, every few decades, another species was discovered, drawn into the gravitational pull of war. Why would this one be any different? Their technology was outdated. Their planet barely registered as a strategic asset. They were, by all definitions, insignificant. Primitive, soft, but then, a small coalition fleet made a mistake. It entered human space without warning, expecting compliance, perhaps some light resistance, maybe even surrender. Instead, they got something entirely different. The humans didn't ask questions. They didn't send diplomats. They didn't hesitate. They retaliated. It wasn't just their weapons, though those were brutal enough. It was the way they fought, unrelenting, coordinated, fierce beyond logic. These weren't the calculated, methodical strikes the galaxy had come to expect. These were acts of sheer defiance. A species that had never known interstellar war rose to meet it like they'd been waiting for it. In hours, not days, not weeks, the invading fleet was gone. Not crippled, not scattered, gone. At first, the galaxy laughed. A fluke, they said. A lucky victory by a desperate species. But then it happened again and again. Human forces spread like wildfire, not because they had the most ships or the most advanced AI, but because they understood something others had forgotten. They understood how to end wars. They didn't negotiate when it wasn't necessary. They didn't seek honor in combat. They didn't fight for territory or pride or tradition. They fought to win, completely, decisively. And when humans fight to win, they don't stop until there's nothing left to oppose them. All across the war, ravaged galaxies, species that had fought each other for generations suddenly found themselves retreating from a new kind of terror. Not monsters, not machines, humans. They were relentless, not because they loved violence, but because they hated it, because they understood what war really was, what it cost. And so when they fought with the singular purpose of making sure they'd never have to fight again. It was as if a sleeping giant had stirred, and once awake, it didn't roar, it whispered. It whispered with the silent propulsion of warships emerging from subspace. It whispered with the cold precision of orbital strikes. It whispered with the calm, ruthless clarity of soldiers who had nothing left to prove, only something to protect. And just like that, the galaxy changed. Factions that had warred for centuries suddenly found themselves united, not by peace, but by fear. They saw in humanity not a new enemy, but a reckoning, a force of nature that couldn't be bribed, couldn't be reasoned with, and most terrifying of all, couldn't be stopped. When humans joined the war, it didn't evolve, it ended. And if you ask the survivors, if you ask those who watched entire campaigns collapse in the blink of an eye, they'll tell you the same thing. It wasn't the size of their armies. It wasn't the power of their weapons. It was the will of a species that had spent its entire existence fighting, to live, to thrive, to endure, and had finally decided enough. There was a time before the silence, when the stars trembled with fire and fury, when the sky was not a place of wonder, but a battlefield painted with the wreckage of civilizations. The war had gone on for so long that no one remembered why it began. Perhaps it started with a border dispute, or an ancient insult, or the ambition of a long-forgotten emperor. Whatever the cause, the consequences were undeniable. Countless worlds laid to waste, countless species dragged into a spiral of destruction. War had become a machine, feeding on hatred, inertia, and fear. Every time one alliance rose, another crushed it. Every new strategy was countered, every advantage short-lived. For some species, war was their birthright. For others, it was their only means of survival. But for all of them, it had become their identity. And in the shadows of this endless conflict, no one noticed the humans. They were distant, isolated, quiet, just one more sapient species developing in the cold arms of a spiral galaxy. They had no great fleets, no psychic commanders, no ancient technologies passed down by extinct gods. They had nuked their own planet more than once, fought each other until their maps bled borders, but they had survived again and again through fire, plague, and madness. They were tenacious, irrational, driven by something few in the galaxy could understand anymore: hope. When the war finally touched their edge of space, the galaxy assumed they would fold. Every new species did in the beginning. What chance did a species like humanity have against veterans of star-spanning empires? The fleets that arrived in Earth orbit didn't come to negotiate, they came to demand. Surrender, tribute, integration. The humans said no, and then they made their move, no hesitation, no delay. In a matter of hours, the invaders were reduced to drifting debris and fading signals. And humanity they didn't celebrate, they didn't gloat. They analyzed, adapted, and retaliated. The galaxy had seen strength before, but this was something else. Humans didn't fight like warriors. They fought like survivors, brutal, calculated, focused. Where other species fought to prove superiority, humans fought to end the threat. Their tactics were unfamiliar, their psychology unpredictable. They sacrificed their own units if it gave them a tactical edge. They turned their enemies' weapons against them. They weaponized fear, speed, chaos, and they didn't stop. At first, the warlords laughed it off, a lucky species, a fluke, but one by one they began to fall. Human fleets spread across the stars, not the largest or most advanced, but the most effective. They didn't seek conquest. They sought closure. They weren't looking to take planets. They were looking to end the war that had devoured the stars for generations. And somehow they did. In hours, entire sectors shifted. In days, whole factions dissolved. Human special operations dismantled command networks that had endured for centuries. Diplomats followed not to parley, but to offer one choice: ceasefire or annihilation. What terrified the galaxy wasn't just human power. It was their clarity. They knew what war was. They had drowned in it, clawed their way through it, and emerged with one cold promise: never again, and they would burn down the galaxy to keep that promise. Even the oldest species, the ones who thought themselves immune to fear, felt it, because the humans weren't fighting for territory or resources. They were fighting to stop fighting, to break the cycle, to force an ending that no one else had the will to imagine, and they didn't ask permission. What took centuries of conflict was undone in a matter of hours because a single species decided that peace was worth any cost. And humanity has always paid its debts in full with interest. Today, those who remember that time do so with awe and silence, not out of hatred, not out of fear, but respect. Because for all the fire and fury the galaxy had once known, it took a quiet species from a quiet world to remind them of something they'd all forgotten. Wars aren't won by strength alone. They're ended by those who refuse to let them continue. We thought we had seen it all. I've lived through 3 centuries of war. I've watched supernova engineered to destroy star systems. I've seen planets turned into weapons, entire moons converted into command stations, oceans boiled away in seconds. The war had no face, no end, just endless fronts, endless destruction. Across the stars, battle lines were drawn and redrawn, alliances forged in desperation, broken in betrayal. The younger species joined for survival. The older ones, like mine, stayed because we had forgotten how not to. Then came the transmission. A new species had emerged on the far edge of the Orion Arm, Sol system, blue planet. Carbon-based bipeds, aggressive history, rapid industrialization. We called a meeting, briefed the admirals, another primitive race. We said, they'll either collapse under the first strike or Beg for inclusion. We were wrong. The first contact wasn't diplomatic. A scout fleet intercepted a human transmission, something they call a news broadcast. It was a strange thing, chaotic, loud, filled with strange humor and raw emotion. We thought it was a mistake. Surely, a warlike species would be more disciplined, more focused. But that was our first lesson. Humans aren't like the others. When the Vanguard fleet entered their system, we expected resistance, yes, but nothing we hadn't crushed before. Within minutes of breaching the outer planets, 2 cruisers disappeared, not damaged. Gone, their data blacked out. No distress signals. The fleet moved in cautiously. The rest followed protocol. Then the humans retaliated. They didn't send a warning. They didn't open a channel. They sent a weapon we still don't fully understand. Fast, small, brutal, designed not to cripple but to finish. Entire ships cut in half. Boarding parties landed not to negotiate but to neutralize, and they did it without overwhelming numbers, without superior technology. They used what they had with terrifying creativity, and when they struck to end it by the time the fleet withdrew. Barely half of it remained, and Earth, unscarred, defiant. It wasn't the loss that frightened us, it was the efficiency. That was the beginning of the end. Other factions laughed at first, but soon. Reports came in from other fronts, human vessels appearing where they shouldn't, intercepting transmissions, disrupting supply lines, operating outside any known doctrine. They didn't just fight, they adapted mid-battle. They didn't follow the old rules, they rewrote them, and in every encounter the pattern held. The humans didn't come to conquer, they came to stop the war, and they didn't care whose side you were on. They made no distinction between aggressors and defenders. If you fought, you were part of the problem. If you refused peace, you were in their way. Some tried to talk, others threatened them, some even offered alliance. The response was always the same: end the war, or we'll end you. At first, it sounded like arrogance. Then entire fleets vanished in coordinated strikes. Dozens of command hubs destroyed without warning, not with brute force, but precision, surgical, strategic, cold. They didn't just strike hard, they struck where it hurt the most, and they moved fast. In hours, sectors that had seen centuries of stalemate went dark, communications collapsed, supply lines evaporated, the war cracked, not because the humans were stronger, but because they were relentless. We underestimated them because we didn't understand them. Other species fought for territory, for glory, for vengeance. The humans fought because they had seen the cost of doing nothing. They had waged war on themselves long before they looked to the stars, and they had decided long ago that war was not to be endured. It was to be finished. That was their doctrine, simple, ruthless. Effective, it took hours to break what we thought was unbreakable, and when the galaxy finally realized it, when the last major front collapsed, when the old alliances were scattered in fear, it was already over. Humanity didn't conquer the stars. They shamed us into peace. And now, whenever I look out into space, into the quiet that followed, I remember one simple truth. It wasn't the strength of their weapons that changed everything. It was the strength of their will. And nothing in this universe is more dangerous than a species that decides enough is enough. No one remembers how the war started anymore. Its ancient history, lost in the wreckage of 1,000 burned worlds and forgotten treaties. The war became something bigger than politics or power. It was a cycle, a rhythm, a curse carved into the bones of the galaxy itself. Species rose, joined the fight, and were swallowed. Some adapted, evolved, became warlike just to survive. Others vanished, unable to keep pace with the endless brutality. Every planet that glowed with civilization eventually dimmed into cinders. The war never slept. Entire generations knew nothing else. To be born in the galaxy was to be born into the war. It shaped culture, defined history, dictated survival. Victory was no longer measured in decades, but in how slowly you lost. Then came the humans. At first, they were a footnote, a newly spacefaring species from a quiet blue planet circling a yellow star. No interstellar influence, no known alliances, no legacy of galactic diplomacy. They were loud, chaotic, and by all available metrics unremarkable. But they had something none of us saw until it was too late. They had resolve. The first contact was not diplomatic. One of our border fleets had been tasked with testing their defenses, standard protocol for new entries into contested space. The goal was simple: pressure them, assess their technology, absorb them, or break them depending on their response. We expected either surrender or confusion. What we received was neither. The humans didn't posture. They didn't stall. They didn't even respond to our threats. They just attacked, brutally, efficiently. Not like a prey species, more like an animal defending its den. There was no hesitation, no ceremony, no draw, no tactics. They responded with pure intent. Every ship that entered their system was destroyed or captured, every communication jammed or traced. Within hours, our entire forward unit was gone. That was the moment we realized humanity does not bluff. The galaxy stirred. Some were amused, others cautious. Most dismissed it. A lucky world, they said. A fluke. But then it happened again. Another incursion, another loss. And again. Over and over, humanity dismantled every force sent to test them. They didn't just win battles, they ended them. No mercy, no second chances. We still didn't understand what we were dealing with. So we watched, we analyzed. What we found was unsettling. They had been fighting each other for thousands of years. Not skirmishes, not ceremonial conflicts, total wars, on a planetary scale, with weapons of mass extinction. They had brought themselves to the brink of annihilation more than once and survived. They understood war not as a strategy, but as a wound, a sickness, and that made them the most dangerous species we had ever encountered. When humans finally stepped beyond their system, they didn't do it to conquer. They didn't come for glory or tribute. They came because the war had arrived at their doorstep, and humanity finishes what threatens them. In a matter of days, they established strike groups, alliances, and intelligence networks across sectors we had fought over for centuries. They studied us, understood us, predicted us, and then they acted, not with massive fleets, not with overwhelming force. With precision, entire campaigns unraveled overnight. Military outposts were vaporized in surgical strikes. Supply chains were severed without warning, and everywhere they went, humanity carried a single message: this ends now. For the first time in memory, we were not fighting for territory. We were fighting for survival against a species that saw no honor in prolonged war. They weren't playing the same game we had played for so long. They were flipping the board, and the most terrifying part, they weren't angry, they weren't fanatical, they were calm, cold, focused, because when humanity decided to go to war, they had already accepted the cost. And they would pay it gladly if it meant no one else would ever have to. It took mere hours for the tides to shift. Entire coalitions surrendered before even seeing a human fleet. Empires folded in fear of what might come. Not because of what humans did, but because of what they could do. When the last front fell silent, the galaxy didn't cheer. It exhaled, and in that silence we understood peace didn't come because we earned it. It came because humanity enforced it. They didn't just join the war, they ended it, and in doing so, they reminded the stars of something we had all forgotten. Peace isn't the absence of war. It's the will to stop it, no matter the cost. They say it ended in hours, not a campaign, not a battle. The war that had raged across the stars for centuries, perhaps longer than time itself could count. It consumed empires, reduced noble species to dust, and turned the very idea of peace into a childish fantasy. Alliances were forged in blood and dissolved in betrayal. Truces never lasted. Victories were illusions. Every time one side seemed to gain the advantage, another rose to strike it down. The war didn't progress, it persisted. It was a disease, and the galaxy had come to accept it as part of life. Then humanity arrived. At first, they were a whisper. A new signal on a backwater channel, another upstart race, barely venturing beyond their home system. They had no colonies, no presence in trade networks, no reputation. When the first scout vessels observed them, they found a divided, volatile species. War-worn history, planetary scars, prone to internal conflict, primitive by interstellar standards. The general consensus, not worth attention, but that assumption would become the last mistake the galaxy ever made. One faction, overconfident and stretched thin, made a move, a test of strength, a minor incursion into human space meant to send a message: you're in our territory now. That message was never delivered. Instead, silence, the fleet vanished, not damaged, not defeated in traditional combat. Just erased. It wasn't just the destruction that shocked the observers. It was the speed. It happened too quickly. Coordinated attacks, tactical strikes, and countermeasures the galaxy had never seen before. No hesitation. No calls for peace, just precision. The humans didn't wait to be studied. They struck back, and that's when everything changed. Unlike the older races who had learned to fight with patience, humanity fought with purpose, with a terrifying clarity. They didn't view this as another chapter in the endless cycle of war. They saw it as a problem to be solved. Their fleets weren't the largest, but they were fast. Their weapons weren't the most advanced, but they were deadly. Their strategy wasn't grand, it was final. In every encounter, they aimed not to gain ground, but to eliminate the need for future battles. Where others waged war with ceremony, humans moved like shadows. They didn't fight for pride. They didn't care for history. They didn't negotiate unless it served their end game. Their commanders didn't shout speeches. They issued orders. And their soldiers they followed, without hesitation, without delay. The humans called it cleaning house, a cold phrase for something the rest of us could only describe as brutal efficiency. Entire enemy operations unraveled in minutes, communications jammed, leaders assassinated, supply routes disabled before fleets even left orbit. The galaxy's strongest empires, used to grinding years-long wars, suddenly found themselves bleeding at the seams. The war, as we had known it, began to collapse. The humans moved like they had been waiting their whole lives for this. Like they had studied every failure the galaxy had endured and chosen not to repeat a single one. But it wasn't their technology that changed everything. It was their mindset. They weren't seeking domination. They weren't seeking revenge. They wanted peace. And they were willing to destroy anything that stood in the way of it. Species that had fought for centuries suddenly laid down arms. Not out of diplomacy, but because the alternative was extinction, and yet the humans never abused their power. They didn't install governments. They didn't take planets. They simply stopped the fighting and moved on. The most terrifying part, they made it look easy. And when the final battle ended not with an explosion, but with surrender, there was a moment of silence so complete it felt like the galaxy itself was holding its breath. Then came the question whispered by every remaining power, every surviving leader. Who are they? Not what they were. Everyone already knew they were called humans. The question was how a single species, untested by galactic conflict, could bring an entire war-torn galaxy to its knees in hours. The answer was simpler than we dared admit. They were the first to refuse to accept the war, and the last to tolerate its existence. They didn't join the war to participate. They joined it to end it, and in doing so, they taught us the most painful and necessary truth of all, that we had let the war define us. But they didn't. The war had no beginning, at least, not one we could remember. Like the tide or the stars, it simply was. A force of nature, a constant. No species alive could recall a time when ships hadn't darkened the skies of rival worlds, when weapons hadn't spoken louder than words. Peace was no longer a goal, it was a fairy tale. We called it the Long War, not for lack of creativity, but because after a while nothing else felt honest. The cause was irrelevant. The factions changed, but the pattern remained. Strike, retaliate, rebuild, repeat. Entire generations born, lived, and died in the service of a war they could not escape. Hope, if it still existed, had become a luxury for the naive. And then humanity arrived. They were a late entry into the galactic stage, so late, in fact, that many didn't even notice them until it was too late. By the time they were recognized, they had already learned far too much from watching. They studied our fleets, our hierarchies, our weaknesses, and more importantly, they studied our mistakes. The first mistake was ours. We assumed they were like us. When a fleet made first contact, it wasn't met with awe or curiosity. It was met with force. That was the norm. That was the ritual, a test of dominance. You show strength. You show power. You remind the new species that the galaxy isn't a kind place. But humanity didn't respond the way others had. There was no confusion, no pleading, no retreat. They didn't ask why they were attacked. They didn't stall for time. They answered with action. In the space of hours, the attacking fleet ceased to exist. Erased, dismantled, humiliated without spectacle, without delay. At first, we assumed luck, a prepared defense, an unexpected tactic, but then it happened again and again. Patterns emerged, patterns of intent, patterns of control, patterns of finality. It became clear humanity wasn't reacting. They were executing a plan. One after another, strongholds fell. Not to overwhelming power, but to speed, precision, and foresight. Human tactics weren't built on scale, but on understanding. They knew what frightened us. They knew what we relied on, and they knew how to cut directly to the core of it. But what truly set them apart was why they were fighting, not for conquest, not for vengeance, not even for justice. They fought to stop the war, truly stop it. Others had tried to win, to outlast, outnumber, overpower. Humanity wasn't interested in winning, they wanted it over. They treated war not as a theater, not as a performance of pride, but as a fire. And they were firefighters, not warriors. When they moved, they didn't seek to occupy, they sought to extinguish. No diplomacy, no treaties, just a quiet warning. Lay down your weapons, or we will make you. Many didn't believe it, until it happened to them. One empire older than Earth itself held firm. Its admirals laughed, its fleets were vast, its pride unshakable. They lasted 3 days. Another species tried to align with them, hoping to ride their momentum. Their entire military command disappeared in a single night. No explosion, no evidence, just silence. It wasn't domination. It was surgery, and somehow, impossibly, they didn't hate us. That's what made it worse. There was no cruelty, no arrogance, just grim determination, an emotional distance born of long history and quiet pain. When we looked into the eyes of their prisoners, we didn't see monsters. We saw people who had already buried too many of their own. They didn't end the war with speeches. They ended it by being the only ones who refused to feed it. And when the galaxy finally fell quiet, when no more systems burned, no more fleets scrambled, no more planets cried out, we realized we had witnessed something no battle had ever achieved, a choice. A deliberate, final choice to stop the bleeding, not because they were better, but because they had already bled enough to know what it cost. So now we tell the story, not with shame, not with bitterness, but with reverence, because when the humans came, the war didn't end because they were powerful. It ended because they made us remember what peace was supposed to feel like, and for the first time in living memory, we listened.